Michel Foucault became influential because he changed the direction of suspicion. Before him, people often questioned whether institutions were effective, rational, or morally justified. Foucault asked something deeper and far more unsettling. What if institutions are not simply solving problems, but also producing the kinds of people they claim to manage? What if systems of knowledge are never neutral? What if power does not only repress you from above, but quietly shapes how you think, behave, classify yourself, and even understand truth? That shift changed modern intellectual life. After Foucault, it became much harder to look at schools, prisons, hospitals, psychiatry, sexuality, or political language in the same way. He argued that these were not just practical structures created for human benefit. They were also mechanisms of discipline, systems that organize behavior, define normality, and produce social categories that feel natural only because they have been repeated long enough. This is one of his strongest insights. Power is not always obvious. It does not only appear through violence or direct coercion. Often it works quietly through habits, expectations, classifications, and norms. You internalize standards before anyone explicitly forces them on you. You monitor yourself because you have absorbed the system into your own thinking. In that sense, modern power can become more effective precisely because it feels less visible. That idea feels persuasive because it explains something real about modern life. People are shaped by institutions long before they consciously choose their beliefs. Schools reward certain forms of behavior and punish others. Social norms determine what feels acceptable before you even reflect on them. Language itself can frame what kinds of thoughts seem reasonable. Foucault forces you to notice how much of your identity may have been structured by forces you did not create. At first, this awareness feels liberating. You stop treating social categories as eternal truths. You become sensitive to hidden assumptions inside supposedly neutral systems. You recognize that authority often presents its own perspective as objective reality. Foucault trains people to see the relationship between knowledge and power, and once you see it, you cannot entirely unsee it. But this is also where the danger begins, because suspicion, once intensified enough, does not stop at institutions you dislike. It spreads outward. If every claim to truth might conceal power, then trust itself starts to erode. Science becomes suspect because institutions shape scientific discourse. Morality becomes suspect because moral standards reflect historical power relations. Psychology becomes suspect because diagnoses classify and normalize behavior. Even the idea of objective truth begins to look unstable. The critique expands until almost everything appears contaminated. That creates a serious problem, because societies cannot function on permanent suspicion alone. At some point, you need standards that are more than strategic power moves. You need to believe that at least some institutions are trying to discover truth rather than merely enforce control. You need grounds for judgment that are not immediately dissolved into hidden interests. Foucault rarely gives those grounds clearly. He is excellent at destabilizing certainty. He is much weaker at explaining what should replace it. This is why reading Foucault can produce a strange psychological effect. The world starts to look less solid. Every category becomes historically constructed. Every institution becomes disciplinary. Every claim to neutrality becomes a mask for power. At first, this feels intellectually sophisticated because you are detecting structures beneath appearances. But over time, the habit of suspicion can become totalizing. You stop asking whether something is true and begin asking only what function it serves. Arguments are no longer evaluated primarily by evidence or logic, but by the systems of power surrounding them. The focus shifts from truth to genealogy, from whether a claim corresponds to reality to how that claim emerged historically. That move changes the nature of thought itself. Because once explanation becomes primarily about power, disagreement starts to feel less like intellectual conflict and more like strategic positioning. People are not wrong because they failed to reason carefully. They are expressions of systems, institutions, social conditioning, or historical forces. Their ideas become symptoms before they become arguments. This weakens the possibility of genuine dialogue. Not intentionally, perhaps, but structurally. If everyone is shaped by hidden power relations, then claims to objectivity begin to look naive at best and manipulative at worst. Suspicion becomes the default stance. And while some suspicion is necessary in a healthy society, permanent suspicion corrodes the foundations required for shared understanding. There is also a deeper irony in Foucault's method. He exposes how systems of knowledge are connected to power, but his own analyses still make claims about reality. He still wants you to believe his descriptions are accurate, insightful, revealing. Yet if all truth claims are entangled with power, then his own framework cannot easily escape the same suspicion it directs at others. This creates a tension he never fully resolves. The critique is powerful enough to destabilize certainty, but not stable enough to rebuild confidence afterward. It teaches you how to dismantle narratives, but not clearly how to live once every narrative appears compromised. That is where the danger becomes real. Not because Foucault encourages tyranny or dishonesty, but because a worldview built primarily around distrust can slowly undermine the possibility of intellectual stability itself. And once distrust becomes your primary lens, eventually everything starts to look like manipulation, including truth. The deeper issue emerges when Foucault's method stops being a tool for criticism and becomes a total way of seeing the world. In limited doses, suspicion is healthy. Institutions should be questioned. Systems of authority should not automatically be trusted simply because they present themselves as rational or scientific. History contains too many examples of experts, governments, and moral systems using the language of truth to justify control. Foucault is valuable because he forces people to remember that. He reminds you that power often hides behind neutrality, that categories presented as natural may actually be historical constructions, that institutions do not merely describe human behavior, but shape it. These are important insights, especially in societies that tend to trust official language too easily. The problem begins when this insight expands beyond correction and becomes atmosphere. Because once you start interpreting everything through the relationship between knowledge and power, the distinction between truth and strategy becomes increasingly unstable. A scientific claim is no longer primarily evaluated on whether it corresponds to reality, but on what institutional structure produced it. A moral position is examined less for whether it is right and more for whose interests it reinforces. Even language itself becomes suspect because categories shape perception before conscious thought begins. At first, this feels intellectually advanced. You feel less naive. You're no longer taking systems at face value. You are tracing hidden assumptions, exposing invisible pressures, identifying the forces beneath appearances. The world begins to look more complex and less innocent. But eventually a serious problem appears. If every framework is shaped by power, then what grounds remain for trusting any framework at all? This is where the method starts undermining itself. Because Foucault's critique depends on the idea that his own analysis reveals something true about institutions, history, and social systems. He wants the reader to recognize structures that were previously hidden. He wants his descriptions to be taken seriously as insights into reality. But if truth itself is always entangled with power, then his own framework becomes vulnerable to the exact same suspicion. Why trust his genealogy more than the systems he critiques? What makes his interpretation revelation rather than another strategic perspective shaped by intellectual culture, academic incentives, and historical conditions? Once suspicion becomes universal, it cannot stop cleanly at everyone except the critic. This creates a strange instability. The framework is strong enough to weaken confidence in existing institutions, but too weak to establish confidence in itself. It excels at dismantling, but struggles to justify. It teaches people how to unmask systems, but not how to determine what deserves trust once the masks are removed. That gap has consequences far beyond philosophy departments, because people cannot live entirely inside critique. Societies require some degree of shared confidence in language, expertise, and institutions, even if that confidence remains imperfect and revisable. Without that, public life fragments into competing suspicions where every claim is interpreted primarily as an attempt to gain influence. And once that mindset spreads widely, something important begins to erode. The assumption that disagreement can be resolved through evidence. Instead of asking whether a claim is true, people increasingly ask what hidden interests it serves. Instead of debating arguments directly, they analyze the structures behind the arguments. Motive replaces substance. Genealogy replaces evaluation. Sometimes this is useful. There are moments where examining institutional incentives reveals real distortions. Financial interests can shape research. Governments can manipulate narratives. Social systems do reinforce particular values. Foucault helps expose these realities. But when this becomes the dominant intellectual reflex, trust collapses faster than understanding grows. You become excellent at detecting contamination and very poor at establishing credibility. Every institution looks compromised because every institution is human, and human systems always contain elements of power. But if imperfection itself becomes proof of illegitimacy, then no standard survives scrutiny for long. This produces a psychological effect that many people do not notice immediately. You begin living in interpretive instability. Nothing appears straightforward anymore. Every statement has a hidden layer. Every institution conceals an agenda. Every norm reflects a structure of power. You stop encountering ideas directly because your attention is constantly redirected toward what lies beneath them. That mindset can become exhausting, not because critical thinking is bad, but because permanent suspicion changes how you relate to reality itself. Instead of clarity, you often end up in recursive interpretation, endlessly uncovering deeper structures without arriving at stable conclusions. The world starts feeling less intelligible and more manipulative. This also changes how people understand themselves. If identity, morality, sexuality, sanity, and truth are all historically constructed through systems of power, then the self begins to lose solidity. You are no longer discovering what you are. You are decoding the structures that produced your sense of self in the first place. That insight can create freedom, but it can also create detachment. Because if every category is contingent, historically produced, and shaped by power, then commitment itself becomes harder. Beliefs feel provisional. Values feel constructed. Even authenticity becomes suspect because the self-expressing authenticity may itself be socially manufactured. This is where Foucault's influence becomes psychologically dangerous for some people. Not because he tells them to reject truth directly, but because he weakens the foundations that make truth feel reachable. The habit of suspicion grows stronger than the habit of trust. Critique becomes easier than conviction. And once a culture reaches that point, it becomes very difficult to rebuild shared meaning afterward. The final problem with Foucault is that his philosophy can slowly train people to confuse awareness with wisdom. Once you learn to detect power structures everywhere, it becomes easy to feel intellectually superior to those who still speak in the language of truth, morality, or objectivity without constant suspicion. You begin to see yourself as someone who understands what is really happening beneath appearances. That feeling is seductive because critique creates distance. The person who unmasks systems appears more sophisticated than the person who still trusts them. To expose hidden structures feels deeper than participating in ordinary belief. Over time, this can produce a mindset where dismantling becomes more rewarding than building, and suspicion feels more intelligent than commitment. But intelligence built only on suspicion becomes unstable. Eventually, the habit starts turning against everything, including the conditions necessary for thought itself. Science becomes just another discourse shaped by institutions. Ethics becomes historical conditioning. Language becomes a mechanism of social control. Truth becomes inseparable from power. At that point, criticism no longer sharpens understanding. It dissolves the framework that understanding depends on. This is where the danger fully appears. A society cannot function if every shared standard is treated primarily as disguised domination. People need reasons to trust evidence, to cooperate with institutions, to believe that dialogue can reveal something real rather than merely expose competing interests. Without that minimum foundation, public life becomes interpretive warfare. And interpretive warfare has no natural endpoint. Because if every position is fundamentally an expression of power, then disagreement is no longer something to resolve through better reasoning. It becomes a struggle between narratives, structures, and social forces. The goal subtly shifts from discovering what is true to exposing what lies underneath claims to truth. That shift changes intellectual culture in profound ways. Arguments become less important than deconstruction. Motives become more important than logic. The social position of the speaker starts overshadowing the content of what is being said. People stop asking whether a statement corresponds to reality and start asking what system produced it. Again, there are moments when this analysis is valuable. History genuinely contains cases where institutions presented ideology as objective truth. Power does shape discourse. Social systems do influence perception. Foucault's insights survive because they identify realities that simpler philosophies ignored. But the problem is proportion. Once suspicion becomes the primary lens rather than a corrective lens, it begins consuming distinctions that matter. Not every scientific claim is propaganda. Not every moral standard is merely domination. Not every institution exists primarily to discipline people into obedience. A framework that cannot preserve those distinctions eventually collapses into generalized distrust. And generalized distrust creates paralysis. Because if every source of knowledge is compromised by power, then certainty becomes impossible and confidence becomes naive. You may continue speaking about justice, truth, or liberation, but the intellectual foundation beneath those ideas weakens. Why should one narrative of liberation be trusted more than another if all narratives emerge from historical structures of power? Foucault never fully solves this problem. His work destabilizes inherited certainties with enormous force, but offers far less clarity about what stable ground should replace them. The result is that many people influenced by this style of thinking become highly skilled critics, but uncertain builders. They can expose structures endlessly, yet struggle to explain what kind of truth or order deserves confidence afterward. This is why the philosophy often produces exhaustion alongside sophistication. Everything becomes layered, strategic, historically contingent, socially constructed. You gain awareness, but lose simplicity. You become perceptive, but also suspicious of every stable category that might allow coherent action. The world appears increasingly fluid, but also increasingly difficult to inhabit with conviction. There's a deeper irony here. Foucault wanted to free people from invisible structures of control, but permanent suspicion can become its own prison. If every belief is potentially manipulation, every institution potentially domination, every truth claim potentially strategic, then trust itself begins to feel dangerous. And a person who cannot trust anything cannot build anything durable. The healthier position is not blind faith in institutions, nor blind rejection of them. It is disciplined judgment. Some systems deserve criticism. Some deserve cautious trust. Some truths are distorted by power, while others survive scrutiny precisely because they correspond to reality despite human imperfection. That balance matters. Without critique, societies become naive and vulnerable to manipulation. But without trust, they become fragmented and psychologically unstable. Foucault understood the first danger brilliantly. He understood the second far less clearly. That is why his philosophy feels so intellectually powerful at first. It teaches you to see hidden structures behind ordinary life. But if taken too far, it leaves you in a world where every structure appears contaminated and every claim to truth feels suspect. And eventually, when distrust becomes your dominant habit of thought, you stop liberating yourself from manipulation. You start losing the ability to believe that understanding is possible at all.